Uh, Great. Thank you very much for everybody that is still here. It's been a long day, but it's been a great day so far. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very excited to to introduce the keynote speaker for this workshop, Matthew Kahn. I don't think that I need to give a long speech about who he is, but I will just mention a few things. I think that everyone in this workshop knows who he is. Matthew Kahn is a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economics and Business at Johns Hopkins University and the Director of the 21st Century Cities Initiative. He is also a Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and Research Fellow at IZA. He will do the keynote session, which will take place from now until 6 o'clock. So you have 1 hour, Matthew, but as you told me before, I think that you're going to give some time for discussion at the end. So thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Steffi, thank you. Folks, it's 9 a.m. in Los Angeles. It's not a sunny day. And I have many friends on our Zoom call and many co-authors. And I want to give an interesting talk. It's at least interesting to me. And please email me with any thoughts. And a half joke in the title. I want to understand why we do the type of research that many of us do. I want to talk about the causal effects of estimating causal climate economic effects. And my talk's going to build on Richard Toll's talk. These were independent draws, but I think I have some common themes with what Richard was just speaking about. Yikes. Folks, here's a slide I stole from the internet. And we all know from 1955 to the present that global greenhouse gas concentrations, carbon dioxide concentrations, have been marching upwards. I'm amazed by the linearity of this, this time series. I am not a great time series econometrician. And folks, do you see that with a single slope, you could fit this pretty well? And of course, the climate change challenge rises. We had the talk on climate sensitivity. The higher this rises, the greater the challenge we face. And as I have stared at this, this is why I started to work on climate change adaptation. Unfortunately, I continue to be very worried that the world's overall greenhouse gas emissions will continue to rise. I am well aware that we are decarbonizing the grid. I'm well aware that Elon Musk and many other entrepreneurs are working on the electric vehicle fleet. I'm well aware that if we decarbonize the grid and if we have electric vehicles penetrate, that we reduce the emissions of the transportation sector. At the same time, and many of you are working on this, there's a huge increase in energy demand in the developing world. Catherine Wolferman co-authors their very nice JEP paper. Lucas Davis and Paul Gertler, their work on air conditioning in Mexico, work on vehicle ownership all over the world. Richard mentioned Jared Diamond, and in his book Collapse, he talks about the world achieving the American dream. And as the world in Africa, in South Asia, all over the world, seeking to achieve the middle class American dream, and what are the greenhouse gas implications if they achieve this? And I think we know that poor people in the developing world need to consume more energy, and unfortunately, much of this will be fossil fuel energy. I'm worried that greenhouse gas emissions will continue to rise. With that as a backdrop, I want to take a look at what many researchers run regressions on. Many applied people, including myself, run these sort of one equation models of some outcome, and I'll be very specific in a moment. The outcome might be worker productivity, it might be agricultural output, and Richard would say that this should be regressed on weather, on the realization, but I don't want to be known as a weather economist, so I want to talk about climate change adaptation today. So Richard, I apologize for my notation. But so many researchers in so many NBR papers, some of whom Richard summarized a moment ago, are running these regressions, and I've boiled it down to a univariate regression, but I understand that that we can run a multivariate regression. Folks, what I want you thinking about today is how does society gain as we estimate these betas, these causal effects of climate outcomes of weather on various economic outcomes. I understand that this helps young people to get tenure. I understand that The Economist magazine writes these up, but I want to push you in this exciting keynote, which only has 20 slides, on how does society gain as we estimate these. And I think I have some new things to say. I'm going to argue that we, the scientists, actually accelerate climate change adaptation as we estimate these because of learning. I think there's been a little bit of a disconnect in environmental economics from the formal learning literature that game theorists work on. And I want to call attention in a Bayesian world where people have priors about how the world works, that we form sort of a likelihood function as we estimate these causal beta effects, nudging people, firms, and governments to update their priors to better understand how the world is affected by climate change. Folks, to say something slightly pretentious, I think that we help to transform unknown unknowns into knowns and known unknowns. And this is a role we play in helping our children and future grandchildren to have a better life. And I'll be coming back. And this is a big theme. Sefi, I apologize if we just wanted to talk about standard errors. This ain't going to be this. As we, economists, generate and distribute our new facts, people, firms, and governments update their beliefs. And so I want to insert climate economists into the model of how a dynamic system, our economy, evolves. Richard alluded to inefficiency, to Harvey Liebenstein's X inefficiency. I think we play a role in ridding the economy of inefficiency. And that, folks, if you want to go take a coffee break, that's basically going to be the only idea to this talk. So, Sefi, I'm looking at you and that art behind you. We're now done. I'm going to argue that as we generate new findings, that this triggers static effects. It's static, I mean in the cross-section, choosing from an existing menu of adaptation products, but that it also triggers dynamic innovation. I'm looking at Ralph, and I know the LSE's work on endogenous innovation. All the puzzle pieces fit together here, but I've got 20 minutes to make my points, and then I'm hoping we could have a big talk. The central role of learning about climate effects. Folks, let me pose a bunch of questions that I don't know the answer to, but that many of you are working on. There's so many open questions. These are all outcome variables affected by weather. How is our health, our mental and physical health, affected by extreme heat? Patrick Bayless had that great paper using billions of tweets of how, when it's extremely hot, of the anger people report on Twitter. Josh Graf-Zivan and Matt Nidell and many of you have been working on the human capital climate nexus. There's work on how our productivity at work and school is affected by heat. Our propensity to engage in violence. Saul Chang and co-authors write many papers on how heat exposure affects suicide rates and violence. I have a paper that I'll talk about at the end of my talk today related to that. Marshall Burke and co-authors Kyle Emmerich have done exciting work on the agricultural productivity and climate and weather. I'm working with co-authors on how our infrastructure is affected by natural disaster shocks. And folks, just our quality of life and happiness. It's not a sunny day today in LA. I'm miserable. No, I'm very happy to be with you. The beta in each of these cases is as there's weather realizations. What's the marginal effect of these weather realizations on all these different outcomes? Folks, here are some examples of papers I like estimating climate damage in pure. These are climate damage papers, and Richard alluded to several of these before. Some of these are micro papers, some of these are macro papers. For example, Jisung is here. He's written an excellent paper that just came out on how American teenagers score on the SATs on hot versus cooler days. There's a series of papers being published on an almost weekly basis on what these marginal damage papers. Each of these yields an estimate of the beta vector. So folks, here's the meat of my talk, and here's me and Greta. So Greta Thunberg is a much more important person than I am, and she's a much more passionate person than I am. She's been making the case that we need a shutdown of carbon dioxide can't keep rising in the atmosphere. Folks, we're economists. I want you to think who's at the margin. Whose minds has Greta changed as she has advocated for carbon mitigation? I'm going to argue, and perhaps this is a little bit controversial, that we as economists, as we estimate our betas, are more likely to trigger private sector adaptation by households, firms. There's more economic agents at the margin with households and firms than there are governments. Let me briefly explain here. Folks, I'm a University of Chicago trained economist, and George Stigler and Sam Peltzman taught us that, and Maker Olson, that in interest group competition, there are organized sides, and those who benefit from the status quo have strong incentives to lobby and to defeat dispersed interest groups. I'd like to debate with you guys. So my focus today is the second point, but I'd like to debate with you guys, how does our research raise the probability of carbon taxes and carbon mitigation? But that is not the focus of my talk today. I'm more optimistic that we have a causal effect in accelerating adaptation than I am about how our enterprise accelerates carbon mitigation. I partially want to cause a fight there, but that's not my focus. My focus today is climate change adaptation. So what goes on in several of the climate papers that I mentioned before is that people estimate a climate damage function. Here I'm taking an expectation of an outcome for person I who's part of group J at location L at time T. And people estimate these regressions. Richard just presented one of these climate damage functions. What happens in many papers is the following three-step estimation strategy. We then borrow a climate science model to predict future weather conditions, J periods in the future, based conditional on greenhouse gases at that time. We then substitute this step 2 into step 1 to predict what the future will be like under business as usual. And we often make the New York Times and The Economist magazine. And folks, I have to admit, my paper with Hashim Pesarad and co-authors, we made the news for our prediction of the year 2100. What I want you thinking about is we continue to make these predictions in the future. Why do we do this? Is this a prediction that we believe, or is this because of the Paul Revere effect? We want to change the world by scaring everyone. And folks, you can only scare someone if it's new information. If people already knew the fact that we've uncovered, or what we claim as a fact, then what have we done? So what I want you to begin to think about is, what is the causal effect of our causal effects? And this is what I'll be focusing on in my remaining remarks. In the paper by Jusung and co-authors, they do not do this exercise. So I already told you what they do in their paper, but I want to make sure everybody sees the three-step approach. And folks, this is not what they do in their paper. So if a climate damage researcher estimated a test score regression and documented that on days above 75 degrees Fahrenheit, that there's a slope of -4 for the average test score taker. If you then had a model of how much hotter it would be in the future, and if your prediction is that it will be 3 degrees hotter in the future, then what the three-step approach would do is they would take the -4, multiply it by 3, and say that it will be that people's scores in the future on standardized tests will be 12 points lower due to climate change. This is a reduced form climate change prediction. And folks, what I want you thinking about is the bottom bullet point. If we didn't know about the prediction of the 12, the marginal reduction in test scores caused by climate change, if we now learn this fact and we believe this fact, that we now consider a whole host of adaptation strategies, such as installing air conditioning in public schools, now that we better understand the damage. from not making this investment. And so what interests me here is if the public finds our estimates to be credible, then this triggers behavioral change. Economists, this is the Lucas critique as we begin to better understand the rules of the game and how they're changing, economic agents reoptimize. And I am claiming that environmental economic research accelerates this behavioral change. Our research is an input in the adaptation function because of X inefficiency that Richard Toll alluded to. Folks, I'm going to turn to Gary Becker's household production framework, which I think has not been used enough in climate economics. Take a look at my timing. In Becker's framework, each of us wants to be safe, healthy, and comfortable, and to raise happy children. Gary Becker, my teacher, assumed that people know the production function of how to produce these. Folks, Harvey Liebstein wrote a famous paper 50 years ago where he talked about how inefficiencies can arise. I want to raise the point that Liebenstein's work is especially relevant today in the climate change context, that many economic agents don't know how to produce safety, health, and comfort as the climate changes. The non-stationarity is the non-stationarity of weather conditions. The role we play as economists is showing them the losses they will incur if they continue to base their choices on their past rules of thumb. And so a point I want to walk you through with a little bit of geometry is how we gain as we better understand the new laws of motion that we face. Reduced form climate damage functions help to sketch out the household production possibility frontier. And then if we're inefficient in our choices, we can do better. So folks, from basic Econ 101, here's what I have here. And I want to convey my point with the most stripped down example. And so I apologize for bringing us back to Econ 101. We are in pizza and comfort space. People want to be comfortable. Folks, budget constraint 1 is what a person would face if the weather is cool outside. And so the opportunity cost of pizza consumption is you could be more comfortable if you consume less pizza. Comfort inside. If you don't have an air conditioner, and if the weather is hot, that rotates you to budget constraint 2. Implicitly, the price of comfort has gone up in a Gary Becker setting. Folks, what budget constraint 3 is the following. You pay F units of pizza to purchase an air conditioner, and then you're better able to offset the heat. And so the way I've set this up is the consumer loses utility, but in the face of the hotter weather, but she does better and can partially adapt by this adjustment in durables, moving from budget line 2 to budget line 3 and reoptimizing. Now, what climate change does, if the person was unaware of the comfort production function, is it rotates the budget line from budget line 2 to budget line 4. I hope you see that what I'm modeling here with basic microeconomics is what climate change does is the weather realizations are such that it's even more difficult for the household to produce comfort. And the budget line pivots to budget line 4. If the person is unaware of how heat causes discomfort, they're not going to purchase this air conditioner. If they're aware of this relationship, they are more likely to do so. So what happened? So let me repeat that again and come back to closer to the frontier of economics. What I'm arguing is that our causal effects research leads to learning and updating by at least a subset of economic agents in the economy. Because folks, let me ask you a question. If you say that everyone already knows all of the effects of climate change, then why are we running all of these regressions? Implicitly, we are saying that there are folks who don't know what they don't know. And if our information is processed by these individuals, many of them will update their beliefs and make new choices. And this just While many environmental economists focus on voting and carbon voting and carbon taxes, I'm more interested in private sector behavior. At a point in time, who purchases an air conditioner and what is the menu of air conditioners? So Richard Newell, Adam Jaffe, and Robert Stavins wrote that famous paper that as energy prices went up, air conditioners became more energy efficient. The same idea here, the induced innovation hypothesis, going back to Acemoglu and Lin's QJE paper in 2004. Folks, Dashwan and I wrote a paper that I think nobody has read. We pick up on the Acemoglu and Lin paper, but we argue the following. Imagine if an economy has many climate skeptics, so-called climate deniers, who do not update their beliefs as we do research. If there's a very large percentage of these individuals, then you don't get the innovation, because for-profit companies face a fixed cost of doing basic research, and there's not profit here. If there's enough economic agents at the margin updating their beliefs, then this creates a market for dynamic innovation, because there's profit for the private sector, even if there's no government at all here. And so again, this is the causal effect of causal effects, and this is the literature I'd like to start to see being done. Whoops. This was placed in the wrong place. What I want to show you here is, as endogenous innovation occurs, the fixed cost of durable, adaptation-friendly products declines, and that shifts up the budget constraint again and allows even poor people to be able to afford these adaptation strategies. Now I want to make a new point. If we live in an age of big data right now, could private firms on their own learn step one, even if we were not engaged in this enterprise? Folks, something that I think I want to make a point about, bullet point number 2. One of our comparative advantages is let me try again. While individual firms could have their own administrative data to sketch out how their own employees are affected by weather shocks, would they be able to sketch out enough of the domain of the function, the full Z? So folks, something I want you thinking about is the following. If one NBR researcher can get her hands on 100 different companies' administrative data sets and study productivity as a function of heat, what insights would she have versus if 100 data scientists at 100 different firms each did their own case study, but then didn't publish their study? Because academic ideas are public goods, and because of our skills in doing big data science, we are able to pool data and sketch out the full domain of this function. Because folks, we always have to think by counterfactual. If there were private data scientists, would we adapt fast enough? And my claim is that knowledge would stay inside firms. Because ideas are public goods, our role as academics, as we open source publish, actually accelerates the understanding of this function. And I think there hasn't been enough discussion of this. The discovery process occurs faster because our science is open source and academic. It would be slower. The discovery process would be slower if we were all private data scientists. This matters because in a non-stationary setting, where climate is non-stationary, where weather is non-stationary, there could be significant lags in innovation and substitution effects if people who don't know what they don't know don't update their beliefs because we haven't given them information to update their beliefs. So in the learning literature, and I've talked to some game theorists about this, there hasn't been enough work on the rate that new information arrives. As more climate science economists enter the field, this actually accelerates our learning and means that these lags are shorter. And I think that that's very exciting in terms of reducing our exposure to climate change impacts. Oh, so I said this a moment ago. I apologize. Many local governments and firms have administrative data and they can estimate their own climate damage functions. But because we can pool their data, we can sketch out more of the domain of the Z, of seeing If a school has data on how its children performed in Phoenix, you only have the Phoenix weather realizations. You don't know the same data in Boston. That's what I mean by not sketching out the full domain of the function. When would our research enterprise have no effect on accelerating climate change adaptation? Paul Revere, and I know we have many LSE and British economists on our Zoom call, Paul Revere notified the US back in 1776 that the British were coming. It gave us a heads up and gave time to adapt. Something that interests me is when would our studies have no effect on adaptation choices in the cross-section or dynamics? A couple of stories that I can think of is if all of the Becker household production functions are already known, if the agents in the economy have full information, if we as researchers are behind the people in the economy. So folks, I'm looking at some of you on Zoom. Do we know more or less than the agents in the economy? When I studied at the University of Chicago, when we studied rational expectations, we assumed that there was a symmetry between that the economic agents were using the correct model and that we, the researchers, had access to the same model. Implicit in climate economics is the assumption that we are a step ahead of the agents in the model who are ignorant of their ignorance. And I think that there's not been enough discussion of this point. And so I'm not saying that we should laugh at the people in this economy. Instead, this creates an urgency for us to accelerate our research to educate the public if they're listening. Now, point number 4. If agents in the economy have a taste for robustness, that they're highly risk averse and they know what they don't know, then our information will be of less value to them because they will have already engaged in worst case planning. And finally, if there's large fixed costs to adapting, such as purchasing the air conditioner in that simple Gary Becker model, if there's large fixed costs to adapting, then our information is necessary but not sufficient for triggering adaptation. We, as economists, are always supposed to talk about who's at the margin, whose beliefs are being updated by our step 1 insights. Does our work teach Greta Thunberg anything? Does our work teach Donald Trump anything? Who is at the margin? And I think we haven't spent enough time thinking about heterogeneity of when we do our studies. How does it change the world, besides for getting us promotions and top 5 papers? In my own work, I talk at length about how consumers, firms, and local governments are affected by our insights. And I think this is, yes, just a few more slides. I want to make a distinction between our work and the recent Nobel Prize to Esther Duflo, Michael Kramer, and Abhijit Banerjee. Development economists at JPAL and at many other centers are able to run randomized field experiments and really trace out more of the causal equation, that step 1 equation. We can randomize subsidies for climate adaptation friendly products like air conditioners, but we can't randomize the weather shocks. This limits our ability to measure population adaptation heterogeneity. Folks, Jim Heckman and co-authors wrote an absolutely key paper in 2006 where they don't have an empirical application, but they talk about in the presence of essential heterogeneity, where basically every person has his own treatment effect. An example, back to the schooling paper, if every SAT test taker had a different marginal effect of the heat, who is the marginal person who would purchase himself a fan or some cooling technology when the econometrician doesn't know, when the econometrician seeks to recover this heterogeneity, but doesn't know who is who, but each economic agent knows their susceptibility to the heat. And I think it's a brilliant paper on point as we try to recover the causal effects of climate on our day-to-day life. If there's heterogeneity in those effects, who's the marginal person? And Josh Graf-Zivin and I have a paper where we study who's the marginal firm in the face of climate shocks. And I recommend that for folks to see an analog. 3 more slides, and then I'm done. I want to give a very specific example of my own work with Killian Howman. So Killian and I released this paper last year, and it got written up in the New York Post, and my mother was really impressed to see us in the tabloid. So this would like being like in the British UK Express. I don't know if that still exists. So what we did in this paper, this was a reduced form paper and a very simple piece of urban and environmental economics. We used a series of data sets in the public domain from the city of Los Angeles. And we established 3 facts. Facts number 1 and 2 are well known. Violent crime is higher on hot days in Los Angeles. Fact number 2, violent crime is higher in poor neighborhoods in Los Angeles. One of the more novel things in our paper was fact number 3, that fact number 1 is more pronounced in poor neighborhoods. In richer neighborhoods, the heat violence gradient is attenuated. The greatest amount of violence occurs on hot days in poor neighborhoods. At the back end of the paper, we report some evidence that the police are lazy on hot days. They don't get out of their police cars on hot days. So folks, in the United States right now, we're seeing a reduction in policing. The George Floyd events are tragic, but we're seeing the police respond to this for reasons that require study, but crime is now up. So there's issues of the role of deterrence. And so to come back to one of my themes, let me do it on the next slide. Here's the assignment, here's the field experiment that I would want to run in the context of our paper to understand the causal effects of causal effects. Are police departments in the United States, like the City of LA's police department, aware of the correlation we've uncovered that violence in poor neighborhoods rises on hot days? If we could have taken our study and boiled it down to a 1-page nudge, if I were part of Esther Duflo's team, I would have wanted to randomly assign this to different police forces and see if you could attenuate the correlation between heat and crime. So if the police devoted more effort on hot days in poor neighborhoods, I think you could attenuate that correlation. So this is an example of what I mean by adaptation. We currently see this fact. We see more crime on hot days in poor neighborhoods. Killian and I have documented this fact. If the police didn't know this fact, and if we now educate them, and if they have a low marginal cost for stepping up their efforts, then I claim that our research would have a benefit for society and reduce inequality by reducing crime in poor neighborhoods on hot days. The crime production function is an equilibrium relationship. It's not a structural object, and that's what I want you guys thinking about. Conclusion. Many of us generate reduced form evidence related to what are the current consequences of weather shocks. My step 1. In a dynamic economy with induced innovation and substitution, do our estimates accelerate learning? Why do we estimate these? And if they do, coming back to that experiment I just sketched with the City of LA Police, why? Who is learning? Folks, I want us to get away from predicting the world in the year 2100. My co-authors keep pushing me to do that. So my co-authors like to estimate step number 1 and then predict out to the year 2100. I think that these are useful because they give us a heads up of the damage we will suffer if we don't adapt. But because we have been given this Paul Revere heads up, it actually accelerates adaptation. So folks, I don't think we have a model of dynamic climate change adaptation where we as researchers are part of the equation as we learn, as we have our Zoom conferences, that this accelerates, and as we disseminate this knowledge through the CEP, through the NBR, through our blogging and tweets, that this accelerates the adaptation process. Now, I have the greatest of respect for Bill Nordhaus, but in his computable general equilibrium model, there were no time subscripts to the damage function. There was, as I read the papers in the American Economic Review, there was no adaptation at all. And so there's exciting opportunities to embed these microeconomic ideas into computable general equilibrium models. I, like Richard, have talked about X inefficiency, but I've brought it to this Gary Becker household production function framework. Weather matters to an urban household if it affects our health, our comfort, and the safety of our children. So I have tried to bring back the Lucas critique into climate change adaptation. In Lucas's original work, government changed policy and forward-looking agents re-optimized. And that what that means is that past correlations can't be used to predict the future. In my setting today, it's not that government changed the rules of the game. Mother Nature changed the weather realizations. And that if agents are aware of the consequences they face, and they're aware because we've estimated those reduced form climate step 1 functions, they have incentives to change their behavior. In this sense, a causal effect of our causal effects is to fuel adaptation. And so next year, Yale is going to publish my book, Adapting to Climate Change, and it fleshes out everything we've talked about today. And I'm eager to hear your comments. So I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Matt. I have a billion questions, but I'm going to let other people to ask first. So feel free to ask your question, guys.
I had a question on yeah, like more empirical. I'm thinking about finance. So I would like to be as optimistic on the effect of what we do on the climate. And do you know of studies in finance where they show that discovering a model on pricing anomalies do make the anomaly disappear? For example, I know there is this value anomaly, the market to book relationship between returns and market to book in the cross section. And apparently the last 10 years, this return on this arbitrage strategy doesn't work that well. But that may be a domain where the hypothesis is more testable. You can obviously make money if there is arbitrage opportunity. And once the model would, in a simple world, we would expect that once an anomaly is discovered, it would disappear. But many stay there for a long time.
So I love this question. The Review of Financial Studies has just devoted a whole issue that builds on your point. Jose Schenkman, I highly recommend this recent issue of the Review of Financial Studies. I love the direction you were going in. Amin Razad and I have published a paper called, we kept changing the title, Mortgage Finance and Climate Change Risk, where we argue that there can be certain impediments in the market. For example, in the US, if Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are willing to purchase loans at the same price, then mortgage lenders can just originate and then securitize those. But I love the direction you were going in. For example, if one looked at futures markets for REITs that are exposed to Miami real estate. So Lint Barrage has been working on this topic, and Lint and I have been trading a bunch of emails on what are arbitrage opportunities. So one point there, it's difficult to short real estate. So suppose SIFI believes that Miami is going to crash in value because of sea level rise, but Don Trump and his friends don't believe that. How can SEFI get rich trading on that idea? What's an asset he can short? And so I think that builds on your point. And I think we need much more work on that. I would call that the Grossman-Stiglitz-Hayek price discovery mechanism, that we will be better able to adapt to climate change if spatial assets prices reflect the risk. They can be inflated artificially if there's incomplete markets, or if government subsidizes these through flood insurance policies, fire insurance subsidies, or government or mortgage subsidies. But I love your question.
I think that Thanks, Matt. I think that Matt Cochin has a question as well. So if you want to go ahead, Matt.
Thanks, Effie. Can you hear me? Can people hear
Yes.
me? Great. Good to see you, Matt, and thanks for the presentation. As always, very interesting and gets you thinking quite a bit. Just a quick reaction to kind of throw out there and maybe kind of push back and challenge you a little bit. I personally like the theme of what you're saying, in the sense like we as economists don't have to feel bad about not really addressing the world's problems and dropping our research and following Greta around. We should have confidence in what we're doing and we're estimating has a real effect here. And what I would say is that it's like, you know, our research on climate policy often focused on mitigation is solving like a collective action problem, but you're sort of orienting us towards adaptation. And then the question is pushing your sort of, you mentioned it a little bit, but your kind of like Chicago sort of approach here is, the question is, well, why are we better than the private sector at solving these problems? You use the example of like the police not knowing that there's more crime potentially on hot days. Personally, I'd be shocked if they didn't know that. It's sort of an interesting research discovery, but it's like, I can't imagine a police precinct actually doesn't know that. And then I think implicit in your argument, your household production framework, is the idea there's an envelope theorem result there, where these gains incrementally on the margin to the adaptation are actually gonna have little welfare effect. So while I actually think that, I hope that you're right, because it's kind of like an Adam Smith feel-good story. We can do what we want and pursue tenure and write our papers and have this great social benefit. I'm not totally sure that we're focused on like the big problems here, where we're sort of making the private sector more efficient.
So let me say two things, and Matt's questions are great. First, on Matt's second point, that's what I meant by the dynamic innovation. If the choice menu changes, folks, the Tesla didn't always exist. Elon Musk made a choice to bear risk to create that product. The envelope theorem doesn't hold when there are lumpy adjustments, and there can be lumpy adjustments because of dynamic innovation. So that's the point I was making here. I want to come back to Matt's first point, which is essential, and that's what I was trying to say here. Remember, I gave that short speech about private sector data scientists. So let's come back to Ji Sohn's work, where he had data on every SAT taker around the country. If every school had their own database but never shared the information with any other school, my claim is you don't trace out the expectations function at the top of the screen. What we do is our work gives global identification. The problem with private sector, so folks, there's been a debate on open source versus closed source data sets. Amazon is very private about its data. Other companies are engaging in open source. When there is open source research, you more globally identify this function, and even, quote, climate skeptics have no excuse for not incorporating these data. When we have private sector data science, again, what I think NBR research does is it aggregates, we sketch out the full domain of the function, and ideas become public goods versus private goods. So Matt, my counter question to you is, what would be the rate of private sector adaptation when there are no public ideas versus when there's just private ideas? And I think we need work on that.
There are a few other questions. I think that the next one is Richard Green. Do you want to ask your question?
I think Chiara was first and then Anna, and I'm third. Sorry, but I was spotting that I had participant tokens, so I saw the order.
Oh, okay. Sorry, this is how it appears on my screen. But whoever want to ask a question, just ask a question.
I'm happy to go first. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Matt. This is really interesting. You touched on this a little bit, but I wonder, jumping back to the consumer side of things, you talked a bit about climate skeptics and the likes, and I wonder how much of that is really not just a matter of innovation being a public good, but rather being publicly available, and how much of this is really a story of information or networks that we have. Because as much as there might be evidence for climate change, if I'm still in a network that really doesn't believe it, and we know that this is more and more common, is this enough? Is all of this evidence pointing in the right direction enough for me to actually, not buy the AC or turn it off more often and so on?
I love your question. Here is what I say in my new book. And folks, this is a hypothesis, and I'd love to see new work on this. I talk in my new Yale book about the economics of hypocrisy. Do certain climate deniers in public fight Al Gore and Greta, but in private, are they purchasing these products? I think we haven't had enough work on our public selves versus our private selves. And I argue in my book to not judge a book by its cover and this is a hypothesis, but so what's your reaction to that? Because I love the direction you were going in. What I say in my book is who would give a monopoly to just Fox News? Do Fox News readers privately at night read the New York Times? Do they have a liberal daughter? Do they bring in other sources of information? What kind of fool would give a monopoly to, we come back to unknown unknowns. If I know that I don't know whether the information I'm receiving is kosher, do I allow in any other information? And I think we need much more work on this about self-realization and self-awareness. But your question is a great one, and I think we need much more work on it.
Thanks.
I'm glad to go next. Thank you, Matthew, for this very, very interesting talk. I've been thinking, so if here we are considering there is heterogeneity of impacts, what about heterogeneity of information and capacity to adapt to this information? So wouldn't that be a kind of an idea that having this heterogeneity of adaptation possibilities increasing the inequalities in that sense? Thank you.
You're correct. So I agree with everything you said. To rephrase that, and I agree that because of this, I do think that adaptation is regressive for exactly the logic you were sketching out. But if we're aware of that, what could the Gates Foundation, so folks, in my slides, I had household firms and governments, but I didn't have foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, George Soros. If these entities are aware that the poor face barriers, either information processing or just coming back to Sendhil Mullathem's work, that if you're poor, just the stress you have in your life, then where the Lucas critique applies is to how Bill Gates goes about restructuring his aid. I think you're on to something there of how NGOs adapt in the face of our research. If we believe that the poor cannot do it for themselves, of how much can the NGOs raise their game on the adaptation front? And I agree. The one other point I'd make is in my Yale Press book, I talk about Jim Heckman's work at length. Jim Heckman has pushed that we need a substantial expansion of pre-kindergarten for disadvantaged children to increase their skills, and that this would help with information processing, becoming a more patient person, caring more about long-run threats. And so the human capital challenge is tied to the climate change adaptation challenge. And I discussed that in the book. Richard?
Yeah, entertaining talk, Matt. Thanks so much. I guess quite often what we're doing may be taking something where the sort of we think we know about this, but let's make it precise. And obviously the very best stuff is when actually nobody had got an inkling of something, and then we sort it out and get it well known. But I think quite often it's sort of getting a more precise estimate of something that people may have had a feeling for. And, you know, if the crime in a particular police precinct is very variable, they may well have a feeling that hot days are bad days, but they don't know it, they don't have the precision. And at that point, you know, there are people who won't do anything until they have a precise estimate, and we definitely benefit them. There are those who thought it was going to be small, and we've said, no, it's a bit bigger than that, and they then do adapt. There may be the group that thought it was going to be absolutely horrible, and the more precise estimate says, actually, it's not going to be quite as bad as that. And they may, they may stop over adapting, and I don't know what that does in terms of the overall benefit of learning by doing, which says you do, which is a reason to sort of over adapt a bit. But I think that those were some reactions that you made me think. So hopefully, hope that's useful.
I think you just very nicely sketched out Jim Heckman's point. He was not talking about climate change. In this paper by Heckman, it is verbatim the direction you were going, the same treatment. That Center for Economic Performance working paper has different effects on different people. And it's this heterogeneity. So we get, as microeconomists, we get at the following issue. I want Greta Thunberg to succeed. I want a global carbon tax. But who is this marginal voter in the US Congress who opposes climate pricing? And will he or she lose their seat in November? On the adaptation front, who are these marginal consumers? If we see someone not purchase an air conditioner, is it because they can't finance the fixed cost, or they didn't understand the comfort heat gradient until we taught them? And so this set identification is really at the heart of what Heckman was talking about. So I agree with you. And Esther Duflo could do a better job here, because what Esther Duflo could do is she could randomize the subsidy for air conditioners and see if Sefi purchases an air conditioner when the subsidy is 10%, 20%, 30%, or does he buy it when we give him a Harvard NBR paper showing that his family would on average be much more comfortable if they had an air conditioner on a hot day.
I think that Ji-Sung has a question as well, and I think he earned it.
Absolutely.
I don't know about that. So first of all, Matt, thank you for a great talk and for the overly kind shout outs. Quick point of clarification, that paper we're actually identifying effects of heat on learning, which to Richard's previous papers or talk is a separate one than test scores, but there's another paper on test scores as well. But my question is actually more about, I think an implicit concern that Matt Kotchin was raising as well, having to do with the potential distributional implications of private adaptation. But I wanted to ask you your thoughts on what you think, whether you think there is scope for barriers to adaptation that may not necessarily only be either informational or sort of credit constraint in nature. And if so, do we have a role as applied microeconomists in identifying those barriers so that public policy can then intervene to alleviate those adaptation frictions? Does that make sense?
It does. Very nice. My friend Vittorio Bassi and co-authors have a paper set in Africa where they say there's a fixed cost for firms to adopt a durable, like a saw. So guys, think of a saw for cutting door wood. If Ji-Sung and Matt locate next to each other, we can share the saw. What that does in this model is it takes that F, that price per durable, the saw, and it divides it by 2. So urban economists talk about labor pooling. I've pushed Victorio that his paper is about capital pooling. If poor entrepreneurs are smart but don't have capital, if they co-locate next to each other, they can share the saw and effectively reduce the fixed cost. So I want to come back to Ji-Sung's point in several directions. Folks, Louis XIV in France did not have a color TV or a computer. I think that Michael Boskin and Zvi Grilikis were right, that the quality-adjusted price of durables falls sharply. Did your father have a cell phone back in the 1970s? I don't think so. And so without embracing too much of Matt Kotchin's Adam Smith, the Boskin report and the declining price of durables makes it possible for more and more poor people, either through contractual arrangements like Vittorio Bassi's sharing of the saw. Uber and ride sharing is a type of sharing of durable goods. So the new economy and the sharing economy on some deeper level can be thought of as reducing F. What I meant here and didn't say in my talk is that global supply chains further reduce F. China's role, David Weinstein wrote a great paper, I think with Broda, of how much Walmart has improved poor people's consumption power, Walmart is filled with goods made in China, and how mass production lowered quality adjusted prices of durables. So without overdoing the Milton Friedman, the economy over time relaxes more and more of these credit constraints. Now, what Jisung is right, is that poor people borrow at a very high interest rate. And so there is a segment of the poor who can't adapt, and that's absolutely right. But there we get into questions of Robert Townsend's work on risk pooling, of how families pool their resources to overcome credit constraints. And I think that that's where in development economics, we're going to see climate change adaptation and development economics merge, to return to Robert Townsend's work on how you finance lumpy investments and risk sharing more generally. But I agree again. I think that that's a very promising line in development economics. An example, if a rural family in Vietnam sends a child to Hanoi to work, you can remit that money back and then purchase durables like an air conditioner. So Mushfiq Mubarak had that econometrica in Bangladesh, where by giving people bus tickets in Bangladesh during the monsoon season, people moved to the cities, got a job, and remitted money back, and that smoothed consumption cycles. So I'm not down on government, but notice that government didn't really appear in this talk today. It's an exaggeration to say that I don't think we need a government. But as we've learned, government policy can't always be counted on. And I think that we environmental economists have to think hard about the role of the private sector. You shouldn't walk away saying Kahn thinks he's Milton Friedman. But I wonder if there's enough Milton Friedman logic in modern environmental economics. And that was one point I want to push the room on going forward. But of course, there are marginal benefit and marginal cost curves. But has the adaptation optimism had its day at court? And you guys have very quickly pointed out the weak links in the argument, and that makes me optimistic of how we'll adapt as a field.
Matt? We have 4 more minutes and 2 more questions, excluding mine, but I will ask you that later. So next, Ralph, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks very much, Matt. It was a great talk. One of the arguments I think you made was that as economists, we are better possibly at influencing the marginal adapter, right? And Thunberg might have a big impact, but it's futile in the end, because the politics are what they are. But I think there's another channel that Greta Thunberg affects, and that is sort of, you could call this a kind of adaptation, that consumers just buy the right goods without government action. They, you mentioned Elon Musk. I mean, people just like these electric cars, so they want to buy the electric cars, because they think it's because they're worried about climate change. And even though, if they would believe us, then they would already have done that. But I think I've seen that. I've seen this in my family, right? That suddenly I've been going on about this for ages. Now that Greta Thunberg is saying it, suddenly, maybe we should save, on a trip and this and that and the other. And I mean, we actually have a new paper which shows that these kind of facts can have a big impact on what is happening in the economy. So I think that might be another angle to look at.
I agree with you. So Matt Cochin wrote an essential 2008 JPE paper where he argued that when we consume goods, that building on your point, a Tesla gives me private services, but also provides public goods of fewer greenhouse gas emissions. What I don't think Matt had in his original model is green advertising, that Greta's push is pushing young people, shifting out their demand for green products. I think he took the demand as exogenous, and you are correct. And so for the record, I do not want to dismiss Greta. I want us thinking, and I shouldn't have said that researchers are the key causal agent. I would want to retreat to our role as a causal agent. Perhaps I shouldn't have ranked myself versus Greta. So let us retract that from this recorded Zoomcast. But Ralph, I agree with those mechanisms you sketched.
Last question, Charlie, do you want to ask a question?
I will. Thanks a lot for that, Matt. You want to be careful. You don't want to be trolled by Greta's followers. That's the last thing you want to happen. Just a quick one. just a quick comment, and I've got a quick question. The quick comment is about your hypothesis in your new book about the difference between private behavior and public behavior. I wonder if we might have seen a possible example of that on Saturday with Trump's rally in Tulsa, when a lot of Trumpists may, and public say, you know, nice. Coronavirus doesn't scare us, but when it comes to private behavior, they're not going anywhere near the arena. My question is relates to, actually, the question really touches upon quite a number. We had a question, which is this, that I do, you know, I'm totally with you when it comes to private behavior of individuals and also behavior of firms, that, you know, when they can update their belief system, they can adapt in due course, and maybe that adaptation behavior is driven by the research outputs of people like us, right? But if the thing is, when it comes to like truly effective adaptive behavior, it still requires collective action, in so much as, you know, mitigation requires collective action by countries to agree on targets and strategies and all the rest of it. The same thing for adaptation. I mean, you know, if you think about flood defense, it requires a collective action by individuals at some aggregate level. And there's always a risk of free riding, which means it may never get done. So how does this kind of fit into the model here? I mean, you know, air conditioners bought by individuals, fine, but what about this more kind of collective kind of responses, Matt?
I love it. And Luis Quintero, Amin Wazad, and I are working on this point right now. Folks, Vern Henderson and Mitra wrote a paper 30 years ago where they said in the American suburbs, there's no need for public goods because the real estate developer who builds the suburbs takes into account whether to have a golf course, whether to have a nature preserve. The developer internalizes all the spillovers. And if you build a golf course, the opportunity cost is you have fewer homes. But if homeowners want to be next to a golf course, he'll internalize that because he's the residual claimant. So something I want you thinking there in a T-Brew model is if there's a residual claimant, like at a shopping mall or in a suburban real estate privately owned complex, the owner of the complex as the residual claimant will internalize these and make the socially right choice. What Luis, Amin, and I are working on is the following. If you are a real estate developer in a flood zone in America, you want to spend other people's money. You want that seawall. You're absolutely right. But you want the people of some other area to pay for it. And so I'm very interested in the US context when we have local public goods. Do you use federal money to subsidize local public goods? And that's what I'm working on now. So there was a great question before about financial markets. If federal money can be used to subsidize local public goods, then you might see higher real estate prices in at-risk places, not because people are idiots, but because they understand the political economy, that more Army Corps of subsidized engineering money is coming. And that's what I'm working on now when I'm not giving big, think, puffy talks. And on Charlie's point, I had the same thought in Tulsa. Did people stay home because even if they liked Trump, did they privately, did they fear the disease and want to reduce their own exposure? But Sophie, thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much for this really outstanding and you know, thought-provoking, I would say even, talk. So we ran out of time. We have a break. So Matt, if you want to stop the recording now, I think it's going to be good. Yeah, absolutely.